Well, Kurt, it's good to have you here again. We want to talk a little bit today about optimizing advisory boards, which I know you have a ton of experience on. And just for those that are watching, your background, you're coming in with allied executives, and you guys specialize on the peer-to-peer groups for leaders. I don't know if there's anything more you want to add.
Yeah, I'd say specifically we serve the owners, CEOs, presidents, what I like to say is a strategic decision maker of the business for second stage businesses. So companies with a growth plan, they want to go somewhere. They're at various stages of that growth, some early, some mid, some mature. And we put them in groups based on where they're at in their growth stage, and we surround them with others that are on that journey, and we try and basically deliver an experience that helps them do that and shortens their time frame to success.
Well, so then this will be a really good topic.
I'm looking forward to it, yeah.
So we're going to talk about optimizing advisory boards, and really, how do I optimize advisors to maximize the impact on the business? And so let's just start out with that topic, like, why are advisory boards kind of an essential piece for presidents, CEOs, owners? Like, what makes them so important?
I think there's a few things, but probably top of the list is we get so in our business that a lot of times it's hard to see the forest through the trees. And so being able to step outside of that business, I know it's popular to say on the business versus in it and how much you should or shouldn't be. I don't know the right answer to that. I just know that you need to be on it at times. And a lot of times the best way to be on it is to be able to get outside perspective. We don't know what we don't know. And I've been guilty of that. Yep. I'm a big proponent of peer groups. That's how I got involved in what I'm doing now. Is I was originally a member of one. And so the value I got out of just having different perspectives from a wide set of different experiences, industries, backgrounds, you name it, was just enlightening. So it just kind of helps us get more clear, I would say, and just be able to draw from a lot of different experiences very quickly.
I always take the manufacturing frame like a little bit of the fresh set of eyes, right? If you're doing a Kaizen event, you always kind of drop one or two people into the event that has never seen it before, so they get new ideas. So that's really helpful. When you think about advisory boards, how do they differ from maybe traditional executive groups? Like, is there a difference in terms of these different groups? Because there's the old saying that, hey, if you're an owner or leader, you should have the right operating system, the right coach, and the right advisory board. But there's different types, right? Mm-hmm. So how does an advisory board maybe differ from some of the other traditional groups? Yeah,
so the way I think of an advisory board is it's very much there to serve the primary shareholder, owner of the business, CEO of the business, right? And so it's kind of a hand-picked, generally 3 to 5, maybe 6 people. I think an odd number is better for the obvious reasons, but
in case you have to vote.
Yeah, and it's there to really be able to help you think through sometimes the what's of the business, right? So if you're making a strategic direction decision, or you're going after something maybe you haven't done before, maybe you're in a spot where you're looking at acquiring a business. It's a vehicle at which you can get deeper and kind of hand pick the expertise you need for exactly what your objectives are for the group. And so that's also going to dictate how well it works for you.
Right.
If you're clear on the front end what you want out of it, what the objective is, then you can obviously, staff it appropriately, give it the charter it needs to be able to help you, and then surround yourself with the right skill sets to be able to pull that off. So that's where, to me, advisory board fits in. Where a peer group would sit in is generally much larger. So think a dozen people around the table. It's probably going to be, if it's constructed well, you're going to be in group with other folks that are on a similar journey to you, so the conversations are very relevant. It's where you can go to test your ideas, put them on the table. You're going to hear from a lot of different people's experiences, so it really helps you with the what's. It's when you're at that point, you're like, hey, there's some very specific hows that I want to make sure I don't stub my toe. That's when I think bringing in an advisory board really starts to make some sense.
Got it.
And it doesn't matter. I think, people talk about, what revenue or maybe even number of employees you should do it. I don't think that's relevant. I think it can be just anywhere along your continuum as long as you're clear what that advisory board's there to help you to do.
It's interesting. So with that mindset, are there typical problems, questions that an advisory board is maybe set up to address, and maybe some that aren't? Like thinking about that spectrum.
Yeah, I try to think of it. So I've been on a couple. I've had one, and then obviously, through the members of our community, I sometimes contribute to helping them think through who to put on their own and that kind of thing. So, kind of examples that come to mind. I just brought up a little earlier this acquisition. I mean, we're in this the last few years. It's a very popular topic, right? And there's a lot of curiosity around whether you're the acquirer or whether you want to be acquired. And that's a big, murky area that not a lot of people have experience with. If you're a first timer in that, it can be intimidating. So being able to surround yourself with some folks that, have experience do that is really good and to be beneficial, and they're going to kind of guide you how, right? So I think about, who might you want to have on your advisory board to help you through that. Well, obviously a strong CPA partner would be very beneficial. Someone from the legal space who's done these a number of times and kind of help you understand what's going to happen when and how that's going to feel for you. Someone who's maybe gotten a business prepared for sale and kind of tell you, hey, here's what we have to shore up in advance. That can be very beneficial. Other examples would be, hey, let's say we're trying to go upstream or serve a different market or customer base and you haven't done that before. Okay, well maybe it's, that's when you bring an advisory board that's really tailored to, helping you understand how to do that. So you might have a little more voice of customer around the table, product development, those sorts of things.
Sales, that you're very whatever it might be.
Yeah, so it really just kind of depends on, like I said, I go back to what's the charter and how clear are you on that, and that'll dictate direction and kind of who should be around the table.
Yeah, so you're talking a little bit about who should be around the table. Let's talk about the impact of those people around the table. So when you've worked with people, you've seen people kind of going through this journey, how do the advisory boards typically shift the mindset of leadership? What kind of impact do they end up having from your outside perspective?
It's going to start through the questions they ask. So a really good board member is going to be very inquisitive, very curious. Once they kind of know what, again, their charter or the objective is, what we're trying to accomplish with their strategy, it's being able to ask the right questions, number one, to help kind of illuminate, okay, what do we know, what don't we know here heading in? Certainly speed the resources. So depending on, what maybe is needed or what's missing, generally speaking, if you pick the right board members, they've got a great network, or they've been around the block, and so they're going to say, hey, let's, we need to think about this, this, and this. Let's bring in this person, this person, this person, or I recommend you talk to them, that kind of a thing. So certainly speed and kind of breadth of ideas and resources is, they're going to be the immediate benefit. Obviously, it's going to vary depending on what the topic is, but that's generally the reason to do it.
Kind of expanding the thinking, so to speak.
Yeah, and a lot of times too, it's pushing back.
Yeah.
Right? So.
You mean we have to be told we're wrong sometimes?
Yeah, sometimes we got to hear what we don't want to hear, right? And, and again, my experience has been, owners or CEOs, presidents who, are forming a board. I mean, they're ready for that. That's what they're looking for.
Right.
So there's usually not a resistance around that. But, I've seen it sometimes where there is. And if you're not willing to take the guidance and advice of an advisory board, then, why do it?
Right. So this next topical area is going to be really interesting because, everybody kind of, I think as people go into the advisory board or bring one on the first time, there's this idea that, I just got to get everybody in the room and natural good stuff will happen, right? And so when you think about structuring or managing that advisory board and how they can most impact, what's really important? What are the critical steps that I got to really think through as a business leader if I'm going to, let's say, bring this group on? You've talked a little bit about structure of seats, but I'm actually talking about maybe the meeting itself or the way that we conduct and use those resources.
Well, this is where I get excited because I run meetings for a living.
Let's go
I've been a part of some really well-run board sessions, and I've been a part of some that
less than ideal.
Yeah, call them directionless. And I think, the board is going to be able to contribute to the degree that you set them up for success.
Okay.
And so even before the meeting, so assume you got the right people in place and you got the structure around, okay, are there terms here? How many people? Things like that. Pre-meeting, getting the board members the context they need well in advance of the meeting is critical. I've been on too many where it shows up hours before the meeting, and if your advisory board members are the right people, they're probably busy a few hours before the meeting, not waiting on bated breath for your packet.
Right.
So give them a few days to be able to digest what's contextually important. Obviously the financials are important. Anything around the strategy, updates, things like that. Big proponent of, some boards, will have an update that comes from maybe the COO, the CFO, or any other functional heads of the business to kind of give you, hey, here's what the last 90 days typically, what we've gotten done and what that looks like and kind of what that's creating, right? When you get into the meeting, having somebody who's the facilitator of that meeting, and it's usually not the owner of the business. It's not usually their skill set. Rather, I'd rather have them be a full participant in the meeting. Mm-hmm. Having someone who can facilitate that meeting, even if it's one of the board members, is critical because that will keep the meeting moving. It'll keep, making sure talk time is balanced, making sure the right questions are asked. So that's an important part of the dynamic. Then keeping it on time and on target. But having an agenda. And I would say probably the most important piece is if you're going to bring your board together, have the 3 or 4 primary issues or topics that you want to discuss very clear with a little bit of background around what we need to know heading in so we can have those discussions and the question that you want to ask is very clear. Let's not waste time in a board meeting trying to figure out what it is you're trying to ask.
Right.
So there's a couple of best practices.
Yeah, and those are really helpful, actually, having been a part of both sides of it, being on the board as a board member and being the president with the board. That roles responsibilities is really key. Mm-hmm. And there's been plenty of situations I've walked into boards where literally that's where the first deck shows up, and then you spend the whole board meeting trying to decipher the deck, and then you don't really solve anything during that meeting. So that's really helpful.
One of my biggest board pet peeves is when that happens and then you spend a third to half the meeting going through the financials. It's like, listen, if you got the right board members in, I'll know how to read the financials.
Right.
They'll have the right questions. But also the second thing is make sure the financials are accurate because nothing gets a board off track faster than if there's things
questioning the financials.
Yeah, questioning the financials. So,
fair enough. No, that's really good. Are there any other board role considerations? Like you talked about facilitator. Are there other ones to think about?
Yeah, and again, I go back to what's the chart of the board, what we're trying to accomplish, right? I think it's really, really good to have a financial expert. And I know as you get into fiduciary boards, that's a requirement.
Right.
So have a financial expert in the room. If that's a CPA, generally speaking, it is. That's great. They always bring great value and they look at things differently, right? I think a legal perspective is important, especially, again, depending on the chart of the business, but it has anything to do with acquisitions or anything. Sometimes it's about, how the owner needs to structure things personally and all that stuff. I mean, they're really good at being able to help understand how to do that and accomplish whatever targets they have. Obviously, someone with strong operations background, especially in a manufacturing company, I think that is paramount to understand that. I think the customer side of the equation or sales and marketing, however we want to table that, I think that's an important perspective to have. So we have a nice, well-round perspective. And then, especially in as the larger organization you get, I think having someone with the kind of HR people side of things considered is important.
Especially for big decisions when it comes to that too. Or impact of, let's say, changes that have to be made.
Yeah, and then I think you can round out with specific skill sets. I think I'm starting to see also just as we get more and more into technology playing such a huge role in our organizations, I mean, having that represented at the table is becoming more and more paramount.
And so when you think about you talked about you had been a part of these various different experiences. Do you have maybe a case study of one that's gone really well? Maybe a case study of one that's gone, let's say, less ideal again or not well? That you can use, like, kind of come up with that kind of real world example of when they've done it well. This has kind of actually been an example where it's gone really well.
Yeah, I think, yes. Protecting the innocent.
Yeah. No names or logos will be shared during the.
Yeah, I've been a part of a few where, and if you've been on them long enough, right, you'll go through some life cycles of the business. And so I've been on one in particular for a number of years now, where we navigated COVID, and then we came out of COVID, and the what was important changed so dramatically during that kind of 4-year period, if you will, that the topics successfully navigated a couple of moves, from a facility standpoint, because the business was growing, a leadership team overhaul. So kind of navigated how do we get the right people in the right seats for where we are now versus where we were. Certainly navigated a lot of the I would call it pressures that came with
market
pricing,
pressures, all that
it came
stuff,
with material costs, it came with things related to that. So how do we navigate that and segment the customers based on the growth we're having? Kind of the whole who we used to serve in our past life isn't maybe who we need to be focused on serving in order to get where we want to go. So how do we navigate that especially when there were customers that were there from day one? Yeah, how do you navigate some of that stuff? And so having the board be able to be there to say, hey, we've been there, done that, and various folks around the table with different experiences that, the owner of the company could lean on and say, at least confidently say, okay, let's do it.
So with that, have you noticed then too, you talked about term limits earlier.
Yeah.
Is there a natural kind of attrition kind of where you go through these learning cycles and you kind of need to refresh the board or inject new ideas every X number of years or something like that because you're staring at it too long?
I think you should.
Okay.
Yeah, not everyone does.
Yeah.
I think probably a 3-year term is probably max. I think 2 years better, and I think that's good for both parties. You're gonna evolve over a period of time. And I think it's good to bring in new perspective as you do. If you're in a growth stage, the needs of the business are probably changing rapidly enough to where you're going to need some different perspectives around the table or skill sets that are a little bit further every time, right? You always want to build for where you're going versus where you are.
Yep.
And so if you get too comfortable, I think the board gets stale too, and they get a little too comfortable, and I think the conversations tend to wane. So, but that's also where the facilitator comes in.
Yep.
Kind of keep people on target.
So when you go back and you look at those, like the timeline and all that, so if you're talking specifically to someone that's actually looking to start or set up this advisory board, are there practical steps that you would say do these 3 things first or do these 5 things in order? Are there practical steps that you would try to encourage them to implement?
I think the first thing is have your strategy or your business plan clear.
Is that something that you actually are expecting that the board is going to work out with you, or is that more I want to do it first and then I want the board to like poke holes in it and then solidify it? Like, because you talked about strategy earlier, like is the expectation that the board is working your strategy, or you're giving them the strategy, the vision, and then they're poking holes based on what vision you gave them?
Well, that's an interesting question. Most board members are going to come in, and the first question they're going to ask is, okay, so what's our objective? What are we trying to accomplish?
Right.
So if you look back at them, blankly,
well, they'll know.
Then how do I help you? Right?
Exactly.
So I'm of the inclination that should be at least foundationally architected out.
Okay.
Now you may be in a situation, where the strategy is, we may have some goals and numbers tied to it. We may have some ideas of where we're going to go, but we don't exactly know the right path to, let's say, double the business over 4 years, or go upstream, or let's say we wanted to go, international or something, right? I think at that point it's okay to say, okay, this is the strategy, this is the charter, but we're going to use and bring in the board to help us, make decisions around what's the best way to attack that.
The how.
Yeah.
Not the.
Yeah, the hows versus the whats.
Yeah.
But I think you got to have the whats clear. You can't just. You just won't get any benefit out of putting a board together if you're not clear on what we're there to do.
Okay. So let's assume you have the clarity up front, kind of step one. Then what?
Then it's about finding the right people.
Okay.
Okay. And so knowing the skill sets you're looking for and that are required based on the charter you've put forth. That'd be number two. I think, building that out could be done for most people through their network and starting to socialize that, but also there are a number of recruitment firms that specialize in finding board members specifically for these purposes. There's associations that you can get involved in to help you do that. So that's kind of step two, is knowing who we're going. No different than if you're hiring people for your organization. I think number three is, okay, what's the structure of the board going to be? How often are we going to meet?
Roles and responsibilities.
Yep. What are we going to pay or compensate our board members with? And then what's the meeting rhythm going to look like? And then how are we going to do the administrative things to make sure that piece goes well? I think if you get those four things clear up front, A, your board members are going to be able to participate a lot better. B, they're going to know they're plugging into something professional. And they're going to be clear how they can help. And I think you're just going to get momentum a lot quicker and a lot earlier.
So that actually brought up like two really quick topical areas. One is expectation around the funds, right? Like how much I might pay a board member. Are there just, in general, I could see people wanting to know less kind of rules of thought or rules of thumb. Do you have any comments that you can make towards that?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, if you're doing a smaller private company advisory board, I mean, $500, $750, maybe $1,000 per quarter is pretty standard.
Okay.
Nobody that's doing advisory board work is doing it for the compensation.
Right.
You get into a public company or fiduciary board, that's different.
Yep.
That's very different. So I think, compensation-wise, that's probably a fair range. I think it's important to make sure you are paying the board member as an exchange. You're paying them for their expertise or their insights. It's nominal, but I think it's an important part of the process. I wouldn't expect anybody to do a board for free.
Okay. And then the second piece of that, along with compensation, is expectations, right? So you think about my expectations around how much time they should be spending. Is it just the 90-minute board meeting or whatever it is, plus maybe an hour to prep? Is it that I'm expecting them to do other projects during the quarter? Like, you're smiling a little bit, so like talk a little bit about the expectations around time.
I think that's important.
Okay.
Prep time, not only what you're asking of the board members, so hey, I'd like you to prepare for this meeting in advance, but then making sure that, hey, we'll have a packet for the meeting ready to go 2 days, 3 days in advance, so you have plenty of time to do that. I think that's a fair exchange. Obviously, the meeting time. Are we meeting for 3 hours, half day, full day, once a quarter? What are we doing? I think the other expectation around is, can you get those things set up on a rhythm so they can plan on them? Nothing worse than no expectation around when we're going to meet, and then 2 weeks out of a meeting, someone's trying to reach out and get everybody scheduled to show up. That is a no-go.
Yeah.
Have it planned out in advance. If you have to make an adaptation to it, great. You can always do that. Special projects is an interesting one. I don't think you should have an expectation of outside the board work.
Okay.
Do that separately. That should be an engagement. I don't think you should be taking advantage of a board member in that way or expect that. I think what you'll find is most board members will offer their help and their services to you within reason, where it makes sense. Making a connection, hunting down a resource, or let me dig some notes together, that kind of thing. That's completely okay. But to expect someone to do something, maybe sit in on interviews or something if you're looking for a key position, I think you got to be careful there.
So maybe the last thought then is, with everything that we've talked about, if you were going to have somebody here that was interested, talking to you right now, are there anything that we haven't talked about, final takeaways, summary of what you'd want them to consider as they're entering into this?
Yeah, I think it's just, when you're selecting board members, I think the important thing, and you can't underemphasize this is certainly the skill set is important. I don't know, and when I say skill set, having an operations mindset, maybe that legal background, the CPA background, the sales background, things like that. I don't think it's mandatory. It has to be industry specific. I think just like with employees, we over-index on some of that stuff. Mm-hmm. But I don't think you want to, I think you want to understand, is this somebody who's going to want to be the smartest person in the room, all right? And they're going to want to get involved in doing the work more so than being able to give you guidance. I've seen that happen where you get too many smartest people in the room and nothing gets done in the meeting because everybody's too interested in talking about what they know versus actually helping you with the question you're asking or what you're looking for from the board in that particular meeting. So it's having people who are emotionally intelligent, understand how to play well with others, how to work in a team environment, how to be able to give you experiential guidance. That's what you're looking for from an advisory board. You're not looking for consultants that want to do the work.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring that up is because that's that last point, right? Is you can have these advisory boards, you can put one together, and in the end, unless you actually act upon the recommendations, unless you do something, it doesn't mean that the board members do it, obviously, but unless you're actually going to do something and move forward with it, or you're going to actually try to use it to solve problems, maybe that's really what you want to think about first. Because a lot of times when you get into ownership, presidents, you're going to be asked or challenged, and that's the whole point.
Right.
Be also emotionally ready to do something about the discussion.
Right. Well, and nothing's going to torpedo a board's interest in working with you than if you have a meeting in Q1, you come back in Q2 and nothing's been done.
Right.
Board members that you're going to want around your table, they're going to be looking to get out of that one pretty quick.
I've been there.
Yeah, exactly. So there's accountability to it, and that's a big reason to do an advisory board is so you have that.
So maybe the way to summarize all of it is if you're in a position you're actually looking at starting an advisory board, there's obviously what we talked about today.
Sure.
There's some process methodology to it. There's some selecting the right people part to it. But just make sure maybe you're emotionally ready to actually take the recommendations and do something with them. And if you are, then there's some great pragmatic things that you talked about today in doing that.
Yeah. If you're a lifestyle business, you probably don't need one. Right. But if you're in growth mode and you know that the business is going to need some things and you're questioning whether, hey, am I the right one? Do I have all the answers? That's probably the right time. And if you want to throw some accelerant on it. But that's going to come down to, can you get the right people around the table for what it is you're trying to drive, right? So it's not easy to just whip one together and have it be really effective. There's a lot of components to it. But that's also where, in a peer group setting, you should have one of those too. And that peer group can tell you all their experiences about trying to do this and really help you steer the right direction so you can avoid some of these trial and error mistakes.
So with that, again, thank you.
Yeah.
And if anybody's got any questions after this, right, you'll see the contact information. Reach out to Kurt, reach out to us, see what we can do to help. Because in the end, the beauty of the community that we're in is as we help each other, everybody grows. It's that Mayo Clinic approach, right?
I love that. Yeah, all ships rise.
Yeah, all ships rise. So with that, thank you again, and look forward to the next one.
Thanks for having me.